When the market takes a downturn, a lot of retirees are understandably nervous. They can tend to panic. It can be an uneasy time for many retirees and folks in general who see their retirement savings take significant hits. However, it can also be a time of great opportunity. And this is where I think savvy investors and specifically retirees can take advantage of one move that you can move money from a pre tax account to a Roth account. And this is what we know as Roth conversions. By taking a move from a pre tax account to a Roth account, especially in a down market environment, you can be making this Roth conversion move at a market low. The purpose of today's video is to talk through how this concept will work and to potentially see if this could be right for you. If you've not yet met, my name is Danny Cieniewicz. I'm a CFP professional from Hyperion Financial. If you're interested in saving taxes in retirement, I recommend you hit the subscribe button because we focus on that quite a bit on this channel. I know many retirees can be a bit skittish when it comes to the market. I meet with several of them who their first question is, how bad is it? Or when is the market going to drop? Now, even though this is the case where some retirees may be overly anxious, and I can understand why, it's a fact of life that if you're going to be invested in the stock market, it's generally going to have its ups and downs. But when it has its downs, it shouldn't necessarily be a time of panic, but rather a time that you can be strategic and take advantage of the opportunity that presents itself. This is where Roth conversions in a market low can potentially come into play. I think it's pretty common that we'll see throughout the year that stock market corrections do take place. Even in years that end positively, we can sometimes notice some serious downturns in the middle of the year. And while, yes, it may extend through more than just one year, we can see that throughout the year, there are several times where the market will drop. This is where we can notice what's known as a conversion sale. When the Roth conversion takes place during a market drop or a market low, it could be an ideal time to consider a Roth conversion. And the concept itself is fairly simple. When you execute a Roth conversion, you're converting dollars from a pre-tax account to a Roth account. And when you do this, you transfer the shares from your pre-tax account to the Roth account. As most folks know, when you do this, the tax is due in the year in which the conversion takes place. So the more that you do, the more tax that you're subject to pay. However, when you're making this transfer, what you'll notice is that you're transferring the shares from the pre-tax account to the Roth account. In other words, if the shares are up at a market high, you're converting the same amount of shares, but what you may notice is you're doing so at a higher price. Therefore, your tax bill may be higher. Whereas in the event that you experience a market low or a downturn, you're still converting the same number of shares you would be otherwise, but at a lower price. Therefore, the amount of tax that would be due is less than if the market was higher or if the share price was higher. Let's do a very simple example. Let's assume that your pre-tax account holds 10 shares of an asset valuing $1,000 of total stock that you hold. If the market suddenly drops 20%, your $1,000 will go down to $800. It doesn't change the number of shares in which you hold, though. So if you convert the $1,000 when the market is quote unquote up, on the conversion, that would be $1,000 of tax that would be due at the end of the year. That $1,000 would hit your ordinary income bracket. Let's assume, though, that the market corrects by 20% a month later. If you do the conversion when it's valued at $800, $8 a share, you're still converting the same number of shares. It would still be the 10 shares that you would be converting. But the only amount that you would have to report at the end of the year is $800. Therefore, converting in a market low would lead to less ordinary income tax that you would be subjected to. Now, if we talk about higher numbers, let's say you convert 100,000 or 80,000, you can quickly see how these numbers can add up over time. And what I think can be all the more important isn't just the transfer itself or the conversion itself in which you notice the tax savings, but also if the market does what the market has tended to do, which generally speaking is rebound, you can notice that the growth inside the Roth conversion is tax-free. Now, we did a video a little bit ago on how the 5-year rules work for both conversions and for the interest portion of a Roth IRA. I'm linking to that right now just to make sure that if you're not familiar with how the taxability or the tax-free nature of a Roth works, that you check that out at least at some point. But when it comes to the conversion itself and the corresponding growth, assuming you've had the Roth IRA for more than 5 years and you're over the age of 59 and a half, the growth that you'll experience or the bounce back would be tax-free. We can look at just 2 historical examples, which are fairly recent. both of them taking place within the same year. The first one would be 2020. And I don't think I need to remind many of you folks who lived through 2020, but in February and March, when the COVID pandemic first appeared to start to rock the United States and specifically the stock market, we noticed a drop in the S&P of over 30%. By the end of the year, in December of 2020, the S&P was up about 10%. You'll notice that there was a pretty sudden drop followed by a pretty sudden recovery. Had the conversion taken place during the market drop, that could have been an awesome opportunity to do a conversion and experience tax-free growth by the end of the year on your Roth conversion. And that could have happened all within the same year. We can look no further than the year of 2025, when we also experienced a pretty sudden drop in the S&P in both the March and April months, specifically regarding the tariff talk that had started to take place in the early part of 2025. There was a quick recovery between March and April of 2025 to the summer and then shortly thereafter, in which case markets again reached all-time highs. Keep in mind, had you done the conversion when the market dropped suddenly, it could have been a chance for you to achieve tax-free growth on the corresponding move. Now, if you're following at home, both of these market drops would have taken place in either Q1 or early Q2 of a specific year. And as you know, Roth conversions can only be completed within the calendar year. And you may also know that Roth conversions are irrevocable. You cannot go back and unconvert a Roth conversion. So that being the case, if you do too massive a Roth conversion or too large of a Roth conversion early on in the year, it could throw off flexibility later in the year. And what I mean by that is throughout the year, you may notice that if you have unpredictable income, perhaps you're expecting a larger windfall later in the year, you might feel a little bit uneasy about completing a conversion, especially a sizable one early on in the year. You might want to wait until the end of the year to have a better idea of what your tax year has looked like, what your income has looked like. And as a result, you can then plan accordingly when it comes to tax brackets or other taxes that may trip you up when completing a Roth conversion. Being that market returns are out of most of our control, certainly from the standpoint of how we invest or what the stock market will do, I think there's a couple of things that we can do our best to try to alleviate some of those concerns. One that could be considered is dollar cost converting. And similar to dollar cost averaging, you can consider doing conversions throughout the year on a somewhat regular basis. I think what you can capture with this is you can capture dollars at a market low, in addition to sometimes dollars at a market high, but it'll average itself out as opposed to just doing a conversion at the end of the year, in which case the market may already be up that year. Now, before you go ahead and implement this strategy, I think it's important to understand there are some concerns with this. Number one, this may or may not actually pay off depending on how the market has done throughout the year. The other thing that you need to keep in mind is that this is going to take a lot more paperwork and it's going to require more tracking. Is it worth looking to do this or not? Generally speaking, I don't think it is. I think this is something that can require a little bit more time and effort and may or may not be worth it with all the added work to it. But if you're concerned about doing this on a more regular basis, it's something that you can do throughout the year. Something else you can look to do is more of a barbell type of strategy. If you generally do a larger Roth conversion at the end of the year, just for hypothetical sake, let's say you do on average $40,000 Roth conversion, you fill up brackets, you stay below certain thresholds, you make sure that that's kind of your Roth conversion sweet spot. If that's the number that you have throughout the year, you can look to do a Roth conversion early in the year when the market's down, and then make sure you leave yourself enough wiggle room until the end of the year. That way you can take advantage of a market drop and see the Roth converted dollars go up accordingly, while also making sure that you don't completely blow through the entire amount that you would in a normal year, and you give yourself some flexibility in case an odd thing could happen. It doesn't mean that an odd thing can't throw off your tax planning though, and that's something you need to be aware of. For example, in the tax year 2025, one example could be the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which changed how taxes work for retirees. If you would have taken advantage of the March and April downturn and done a conversion then, it certainly could make sense from an investment standpoint. However, on July 4th of this year, President Trump signed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. That bill instead changed how taxes work for retirees, including a $6,000 enhanced deduction for folks that are over the age of 65. One of the catches, though, is you need to have a modified adjusted gross income below 75,000 as a single filer or 150,000 as a married filing jointly filer. So if you go over that amount on your Roth conversion, or if you had, you could find yourself phasing out of that, which you would have had no foreknowledge of back in March or April. So making sure that you're understanding that things can change throughout the year, which could throw off your Roth conversion strategy, could have an effect and ultimately determine whether it's worth it or not. I'm more of a fan of this type of strategy than I would be the Roth conversion dollar averaging, if you want to call it that strategy, just because I think this can give you a little bit more flexibility and throughout the year, and it can take advantage of some growth within a Roth account, but still add some flexibility throughout the year. But as you should be aware with any Roth conversion, there are three things that I think are an absolute requirement that you understand prior to going through with a Roth conversion. Number one is making sure that you're managing your brackets accordingly. If you're set to be in a higher income tax bracket in the future, that's when I think Roth conversions can make the most sense. If you're set to be in a lower tax bracket in the future, I think it's worth asking the validity of a Roth conversion strategy to begin with. And this doesn't necessarily mean that you as an individual, it could also mean you and your spouse. If you pass away and you leave dollars to a spouse that's in a traditional versus a Roth dollar, well, the traditional dollars are eventually going to be taxed at a single rate as opposed to a married filing jointly rate. Therefore, you could notice that you or your spouse could be in a higher income tax bracket later, but it may make more sense that you're doing so to convert now. It could also be the case where you have future pensions, Social Security, RMD income down the road. And by converting now, you could find it more advantageous to take advantage of the low brackets you're in now as opposed to higher income tax brackets in the future. Something else, though, that I think you want to be aware of is that this is an irrevocable decision. As I mentioned earlier, Roth conversions are not something that can be undone. The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which many folks call the first Trump tax cut, made Roth conversions permanent. It's something that you cannot recharacterize. So understand that this is a commitment. If you're planning to do a Roth conversion, make sure that you understand the implications of it, as it's not something you can necessarily undo, such as a contribution, which you can always redo how a contribution works. You cannot redo or recharacterize how a conversion works. You also should be aware, as I mentioned earlier, of the 5-year rules with conversions and with the contributions and how the Roth holding periods work. By better understanding how that works, it may make more sense to consider Roth conversions at that point. Lastly, I also think you want to make sure you know how the tax bill is going to be paid. You also want to make sure you understand how tax bills will work in retirement. If you go over certain thresholds, you could find yourself going over perhaps an IRMAA threshold, going over the net investment income threshold. Perhaps you're at the point where this will now make Social Security benefits taxable. You could also find yourself going over the enhanced deduction thresholds. This shouldn't necessarily preclude you from doing a Roth conversion. It's not something that should say you shouldn't do it as a result, but understand all the implications of it and do the math on if it makes sense or not. Once you have that answer, then you can feel better about making your Roth conversion move and doing so in such a way that you can maximize your future dollars. If there's a takeaway that I hope you can walk away with here, it's that Roth conversion strategies, while they can certainly be polarizing to some, I think can best be maximized, but understanding all the factors that are at play. Down markets are just a reality of life, and that's going to be the case whether you're a working individual or whether you're a retiree, assuming, of course, that you have funds invested in quote-unquote riskier assets. Dollars that are invested in the stock market can, and in many cases will, lose money. But you can also see substantial payoff if you stay invested properly, if you're well diversified, and if your buy and hold strategy makes sense. If that's the case, then Roth conversion strategies can make sense for you. And to make sure that you're doing this properly, I think it's worth understanding how taxes do work. Now, this isn't something I would go in with blindly. I would make sure that you're working with a professional like my team and I at Hyperion Financial to understand if the strategy makes the most sense for you. And if you're looking for other ways in which you can save taxes, there's one little thing that I think is interesting in the tax code that not many folks are aware about. It's the qualified HSA funding distribution, where you can take dollars from a pre-tax account and transfer them into an HSA one time in your life, and you can do so in a tax-free way. For more information on how that works, make sure you check out this video right here.